Consider who you are this morning as we lift our voices in praise and worship to you. As we hear from your servant, we just are very mindful that you're a very generous God to allow us this privilege in this chapel time this morning. And so we just say thank you. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, stay tuned probably at lunchtime for any announcements with respect to the ping pong tournament today. I don't have any information on that, but Mr. Whirl would. Okay, so just be ready for that at lunch. Okay, do you have an announcement? Oh, you're going to sing. You're going to sing with you? Let's stand.
Sorrow. Thank you. It is wonderful to be back at NBBI. And just so you know a bit more about me, I serve in London, Ontario in the Canadian office, but before joining the office, I was in Japan for 12.5 years. And I'll speak more a bit about Japan later, but if you have any questions about ministry with SEND, don't hesitate to ask. I do have a table just outside the kitchen, or the cafeteria, I should say, and there's some brochures there. We have internships. We have summer opportunities. And if you're interested in some very specific ministries like youth ministry or community development, church planting, there are sheets there. Just help yourself to that information. This evening, I have asked if we could have an ice cream missions event. And if you haven't signed up, you can still do that. If you feel you want to come and you haven't signed it up at all, just feel free to join us. It'll be an informal, I hope, fun time. But I also want to give you opportunities to ask any questions that you have. I don't want to drive the agenda the whole time this evening. I want to hear what's on your heart and give you an opportunity to ask questions. So a bit about SEND, if I could have the slide up there. And the SEND takes its name from John 20:21, as the Father has sent me, so send I you. And we don't want to be just sending to nations, we want to be sending from nations. We're not just a North American sending organization. We have people from Europe and Asia serving with us. So we want to be sending from the world to the world. Now, next slide. When you think of missions, and when you think of our mission statement, it can be defined in the word me, but not M-E-M-E-E. So when you think of missions, what do you think the M stands for? Any ideas? Missionary, good answer. Anyone else? A, mobilization. Can I have the first M up there? Oh. Well, it means mobilizing God's people. And we don't want to just mobilize people to go. We want to mobilize senders. And in missions, we need goers and senders. And so we want to mobilize people to be involved in missions however God's calling you to be involved. I don't want to tell you how you should be involved. Of course, I'd love to send all of you to Japan because that's where I worked. But the reality is God doesn't send everyone. There are more goers than there are senders. And so we need both in order to accomplish the Great Commission. So we mobilize God's people. What do you think the first E stands for? Yes. That's a very good one. It includes that, but what else? Well, there we are. Thank you, that's great. We want to engage the unreached. And how we engage will depend on the country or the culture. It'll look very different in the Philippines than it will from Japan. And it will look different from Japan than it would in Ukraine or other countries in Europe. So, but the key word is unreached. We don't want to go where the church already is established, where there's mature believers, where there's strong leadership. We want to go where there is no church. And so SEND serves in 22 countries around the world and in unreached areas. And the last E is reproducing or establish reproducing churches. So we want the local leaders, the local church to be able to reproduce what we have modeled for them. And so that's our mission statement. Next slide, please. And so there's a map of Japan. We are basically in the Tokyo and Sendai area, and I'll share more about that in a minute. But if I could have the next slide. Get in, just in groups of 2. Japan is, 3 times, 5 times, 7 times the same size as New Brunswick. And just discuss that. What do you think? D, it's the same. Anybody else? Anybody else have or does everybody agree? Yes. A, and the answer is 5 times. 5 times the size of New Brunswick. Now, how many people live in New Brunswick? Yeah? That's a great response. What is the population of New Brunswick? That's a different answer. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to embarrass you. About 800, yeah, 800,000. The population of Japan is 128 million people. And Japan is only 5 times the size of New Brunswick. Next slide there. So this last May, I had the opportunity to go to Japan. I accompanied 5 ladies from Heritage Bible College, and they stayed in the discipleship house, the D House, in Sendai. And the D House is an opportunity for young people like yourself to go to Japan for up to 90 days and learn about the ministry, learn some language, learn about cross-cultural anthropology, learn what it takes not only to survive in cross-cultural ministry, but thrive. And so the ladies were only there for 6 weeks, but the D House is a 90-day internship where you can learn about ministry. And if you're interested in missions, the D House might be a good opportunity for you. We have one in Spain and one in Macedonia, and I know other organizations have them as well. So if you're interested in cross-cultural work, that might be a good step to learning more. Next, so when I went to Japan, I realized that some things had changed and some things had not changed. And one of the things that I noticed had changed is that the technology in Japan continues to improve. And this is a vending machine, and it is a touch screen. How many of you have touch screen computers? Yeah, that is a touch screen vending machine. And on the right-hand side there in the middle, you can see where it's 15 degrees. That tells us the temperature in Tokyo that day, and it fades in and out. And now you can't see it but in just kind of below that cloud, there's an icon of a phone. And if you download the app to your phone and then download money onto that, when you want to buy a drink from a touch screen vending machine, all you have to do is put your phone up to it, and it'll deduct the money from your phone and from that app, and then you can take the drink that you want. So with next slide. Next slide, please. Approximately how many vending machines are in Japan? 4, 5, 6, or 7 million? 6, 7. And the answer, Colby, is 5 million. Japan has more vending machines per capita than any country in the world. And they're all over. You can get, of course, drinks out of them. You can get rice out of them. You can get hamburgers out of them. You can even get some, electronics out of a vending machine in Japan. All right, next slide, please. Another thing that had not changed is the price of food in Japan. It's a very expensive country to live in. How much do you think one of those watermelons cost in Canadian dollars? $10? 15? 20? In London this summer, I was able to get a watermelon for $7. One of those is $42. Yeah. So, yeah. Now, of course, you can buy cheaper ones, but that was a very expensive one. And typically, the more expensive fruit is given as gifts to people who you're obligated to. So if you were Japanese, you would give gifts to your teachers twice a year. Okay, next slide, please. Another thing that had not changed, I noticed this when I was in a train in the Tokyo area. And they now have screens, electronic screens in trains. And you'll notice that it says there, the KO line, and then it says operation will resume, and the reason for it stopping is because of passenger injury. And when I saw that, I thought, that's strange, because passengers don't get injured on trains in Japan. Like, you're not going to get mugged or anything like that in a Japanese train. But then it hit me what that was. Passenger injury was actually suicide. And a way that people would end their life, some of them would jump in front of a train as it's coming into the station. And committing suicide, like for example, if a CEO of a company has been involved in a scandal and has brought shame to the company, the way to restore its honor is for that CEO to commit suicide. Japan has one of the highest suicide rates in the world. And so it's a very, very needy country. Next slide. One thing that had not changed is the religious atmosphere of Japan. And there's a monk there, and he's got his hand up, and he was chanting. I couldn't understand it, and he had a bowl in his hand, and people would give money. And that would be his duty for the day, and it would also satisfy an obligation or a spiritual need that the Japanese had. So next slide. What are the two main religions in Japan? Buddhism and Shintoism, Buddhism and Hinduism, Shintoism, Hinduism, Hinduism and Islam. What do you think? A, any, C? And the answer is A, Buddhism and Shintoism. And there are more adherents to those two religions than there are actual people in Japan. That means that people consider themselves to be both. And they'll have a Buddhist wedding and a Shinto funeral. Next slide. What percentage of Japanese are followers of Jesus? Less than 1, 4, 5 to 6, or 7? 7, some are saying 7. A. See, and the answer is A. Less than 1. Actually, it's less than 0.5%. So Japan is a very, very spiritually needy country. Next slide. So we visited a temple just to learn about the religion of the country. And on the left-hand side, you see those 2 ropes. They'll pull those ropes and a bell will ring. And they ring that to alert the ancestors that they're there to pray. They worship their ancestors. And so they are there. There's a kind of a box right in front where that lady in the white is bowing. That's to put money in. And people they'll only stand there, clap their hands and pray maybe for less than a minute, put in 100 yen or 500 yen, and they'll feel that they have done their obligation. And then on the right-hand side, there's sports teams in the Sendai area, and they go to the temple before the season starts for the priest to bless them, praying for a successful year, and then they sign those plaques and they leave it there so that the people who come to the temple can see that. Next slide. And do you have any idea what that might be? A wedding, right? And that is the traditional wear for a bride and a groom. And it kind of pains me to say this, but you know why that lady has that white thing on her head? I can hear something, but I can't hear it clearly. If you were a Saskatchewan Rough Rider fan, you would do that. I'm from Saskatchewan, and that's why. The reason they do that is to, ladies, brace yourself, to hide a woman's horns. And so, yeah, so that's why. And that's why I said it pains me to say that, but that's what they believe. So they're married at a temple. And the mother of one of the bride or the groom wanted us in a picture. And I said, no. And she said, no, get into the picture. I said, no, it's okay. And I didn't want to get into the picture because we were wearing blue jeans and T-shirts, and they're dressed up. And so she insisted, and so we'll probably be in their wedding album for the rest of their married life. Next slide. And then there's also the cults there. These are Jehovah's Witnesses. And the one stand on the left-hand side says free Bible studies. And so they are there. There's Mormons there. There's the Japanese cults as well. And so in that context, we want to share Jesus Christ. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, in 2011, Japan had a significant earthquake. It was just off the East Coast, a very strong one, and it caused horrific damage. Next slide, please. This is an aerial shot of the shore on the East Coast. And this is before the earthquake, and you can see the houses and everything. And the next slide, please. That's what it looked like after the earthquake. It literally flattened everything. And they believe that they had a tsunami or a tidal wave, and they believe that the tidal wave was between 30 and 35 meters high. And so if it was that high, you can imagine how wide it was. And they estimate that because of how far the water went inland. Next slide. They also estimate over 1 million homes or buildings were damaged. And the last statistics that I saw, they said there were 15,000 who perished and still about 5,000 missing. Well, that was, that was, 2011, so that was 6 years ago. If they haven't found the people by now, those people have perished. So it's around 20,000 people. Whole communities were wiped out by the earthquake and the tidal wave. Next slide, please. I was in Sendai, and you can see that blue sign right next to my head on the post. That's how high the water was in that community. The next slide, please. That's a school, and if you can see just in the right-hand corner, right below the roof, there's that same sign. That's how high the water was at that school. And the students had to evacuate to the roof, and then helicopters came and rescued them off the roof that day of the earthquake. Next slide. But they have rebuilt. It's amazing. When I visited Sendai, I couldn't believe how well they had rebuilt. If I didn't know there was an earthquake there, I would say there wasn't one, because they've restored communities. It's just amazing how hard they have worked. And they have built businesses near the shoreline so that if another earthquake were to hit or a tsunami, that it wouldn't have the same impact. Hopefully not as many lives would be lost. And next slide, please. And houses have gone up. The sad thing is, a lot of Japanese were not able to return to the same place where they were living before the earthquake. The government decided that they were going to rezone things, and a lot of Japanese have moved into places, been given land, moved into places where they don't know the neighbors. The neighbors are new since the earthquake. And so there's a lot of loneliness and a lot of sadness. And in the Sendai area, there's not one person who doesn't know somebody who perished in that earthquake. And so it was just very extreme, very hard on the people. Next slide. So it's in that context, some of our missionaries moved up to Sendai. And Dave and Eileen Barkman on the left-hand side, within a few months after, moved up. And they just provided what they call kokoro care, care for the heart, and gave the Japanese an opportunity to express their emotions, the struggles that they were facing, and in that share Jesus Christ. Next slide, please. Dave and Eileen Barkman serve in a church, and the pastor, with a Japanese pastor, and his vision is not to have a big, large church where everybody comes on Sunday, but he wants house churches throughout the city of Sendai, and he's training his believers to, in their community, establish a house church and minister to the needs, do evangelism and discipleship to the people in your community. And so his goal is to have 7,000 believers in house churches. And Dave and Eileen are a part of that. Next slide. And they have Bible studies, and they teach English, and there's people with Send who have started who are involved in a coffee house ministry. We have some ladies who are trained in foot massage therapy. They do foot massage therapy as a means of outreach to develop trusting relationships to hopefully share Jesus Christ with the people. Next slide. Besides that, we also have a camp in the Tokyo area, and every summer they look for staff to come, and we have English camps for missionary children and for military children, and those are held in June. And next slide, please. We also have camps for Japanese and English camps for Japanese children and adults, and where they can come and improve their English, but also hear of Jesus Christ. Next slide. The lady in the green, her name was Mari. And when I was working in Japan, she came to an English Bible camp in July one year. And she came because her professor at university recommended that she go there to improve her English. So she came, and she didn't understand what Bible meant. She thought English Bible meant it's just a guide to improve your English. And so she came to camp, and on the first day we all gathered, and the leader of the camp said, "Let's pray And typical Japanese, they get their R's and L's mixed up. So when she heard let's pray, she thought, when it was said let's pray, she thought he said let's play. And so she said, yeah, I'm all for that. And everybody turned and looked at her and said, what are you talking about? And through that embarrassing moment, she thought, I better go to my dictionary and find out what Bible means. And so she opened it up and she found out, oh, this isn't just an English camp. This is also a Christian camp. But she was so touched by the Christians that were there because Mari only thought of herself. Everything revolved around Mari. And when she observed the Christians there, the staff that were there, she saw that we cared for each other. We weren't just thinking about ourselves. And that challenged Mari deeply. The following summer, she came back to the camp, and then she attended the Thanksgiving camp in November. And there she prayed to receive Christ as her Savior. She went on to graduate from university, and then she believed that God was calling her into the ministry. So she quit her job at a travel agency, a very prestigious job, and she went to seminary in Tokyo. There she met her husband, and now Mari and her husband are pastoring a Japanese church in Vancouver, BC. And so it's exciting to see the fruit from the labors of people in Japan. And so there is a deep need in that country. But you know, young people, there's a deep need around the world. And I just share a bit about Japan today because it doesn't matter which culture you're in, which country you're in, there's going to be spiritual needs. There's going to be emotional needs. And there's needs probably in this community, in your home churches. And I just want to encourage you to pray and ask God how He would want you involved in touching the lives of people for eternity. Of course, we send people globally, but maybe God has you to stay in Canada. There's still a need here. And so I want to encourage you to be prayerfully considering what God would have you to do. In closing, Japan, if I could have the next slide, please. Japan is often called the land of the rising sun. Last slide, please. Would you pray that they would know the risen sun? We do have a couple of minutes. Do you have any questions that you'd like to ask about Japan or whatever? Yes. Yes. It's not like China or some other countries, closed countries. You can start a church, put up a cross on the outside. You can hand out tracts at the train stations. You can go door to door handing out tracts. So you can share Jesus Christ freely. But so there's not physical persecution, but if a Japanese were to come to know the Lord, there could be emotional or mental persecution. And so it depends on the family. I had a Japanese roommate. Her parents were just thrilled that she came to know the Lord because she was a teenager when she prayed to receive Christ, but she was very rebellious. And her parents thought, well, if this will help calm her down, we'll let her believe. I worked with a Japanese pastor. His parents said, don't show up at home again. If you want to be a follower of Jesus Christ, don't come home. And so it depends on the family. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Why do you believe there's such a great need? Why is there so less Christians in other places?
Yeah, in Japan, excellent question. I think there's a couple of reasons. One is the Japanese believe in 7 million gods. They believe there are 7 million gods. That's the last figure I heard, okay? So when we come along and we say Jesus Christ, or the God of the Bible, there's one God and He exists in three, that is almost unfathomable for them. Another thing is they worship their ancestors. Not just at the temples. They have Buddhist altars in their home, and they will worship them, regularly. They'll pray to them. And so I think that's another reason. Another reason is in the 1700s, 1800s, Christians were persecuted in Japan. And some followers of Jesus Christ were hung upside down on crosses at the lake or at the ocean. And so when high tide came in, they drowned. And that has carried on a stigma to today. Why would Japanese be willing to be so persecuted for Jesus Christ? And that isn't, to them, it isn't an honorable thing, it's almost a shame thing. And so there's still this stigma that Christianity, that believers, were so devout, willing to die, that it doesn't raise Christianity in a positive way. In their mind, it's almost negative. So those are some reasons. I'm sure there's more, but in my mind, those are some of the top reasons. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah. What I have read recently, it's maybe a bit on the decline. Yeah, it is a bit on the decline. And I observed that, I think, when I was in Japan in May, that there are churches that are struggling. And so the average size of a church in Japan has 20 people in it. So, to see a church this size in Japan is rare. So the church is very small. And another reason I think it's on the decline is there's a need for pastors. Not a lot of young people are going into the pastorate in Japan. And there's churches that have pastors who have retired, but on a part-time basis after 65, they'll serve the church. And so, to me, in my mind, the church is struggling in Japan. I think there's good things happening, like that church in Sendai, but there's also many that are finding it difficult. I will be here for the rest of the day. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. And I just have a great day. Thank you for being here. Thank you.